Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. Today's conversation promises to be an insightful one with a remarkable guest. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular listener, we're so glad you're here. Our goal is to bring you closer to the innovative leaders and thinkers shaping our future. And today, I'm thrilled to welcome James Schmeling. As president and CEO of the National Defense University Foundation, James brings more than 25 years of executive experience leading nonprofits and research centers in higher ed. His career has focused in advancing military and veteran education, careers, entrepreneurship, disability policy, and civil rights. A U.S. Air Force veteran, James is a graduate of Iowa State University and the University of Iowa College of Law. Under his leadership, the foundation connects philanthropists, private sector leaders, businesses, and industry with the National Defense University, the nation's premier institution for national security and defense education. The foundation develops resources and relationships to support faculty excellence, student success, infrastructure, libraries, special collections, academic chairs, and international fellows and their families, while also hosting lectures and workshops that foster intellectual exchange among current and future leaders. His mission is to advance national security by raising resources that appropriated funds alone cannot provide, ensuring the university remains agile and relevant in a rapidly changing security environment. Welcome to Tipping Spears, James.
Hey, thanks, Hannah. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you today.
Well, I have had the opportunity to attend a few of y'all's NDU events and can definitely testify to the value that comes through those. Y'all put on some fantastic educational events.
Well, thank you. I'm really impressed by everything that they do, and it's one of the highlights of my job that I get to go and attend and listen to these experts and leaders and really learn.
Oh. So can you tell us where your story begins?
Yeah, I think I'll start on the day that I graduated from high school. I walked across the stage at 4:30 in the afternoon. I got my diploma, and at 7:30 that evening, I was on a plane on my way to Air Force basic training. I was that small town Iowa kid that couldn't wait to get out of Iowa and see the world. So I started there, went to basic training, served for about 6 years in the Air Force, had a great experience there. And then I got out and went back to Iowa, which surprised me. But I went back, I went to school, I got my undergraduate degree at Iowa State University, go Clones, and then Iowa for my law degree and go Hawkeyes. And the only challenge I ever have is, during their football games or their basketball games, picking which one to root for. But I kind of settled on basketball for Iowa State and football for Iowa.
You've got both bases covered
Yeah.
that way.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, did anything in particular kind of spark your interest in serving in the military?
I think there are really two things. I had the opportunity to get to know my uncle pretty well. He was an Air Force veteran. He worked on B-52s and he took that into his life. He worked for gas companies after that, where they actually used the same jet engines for moving liquefied gas and oil and other kinds of things through pipelines. And so it was like, well, okay, this would be an interesting way to start out a career, see what I want to do, see the world, and there is some promise of career afterwards. And then I went and saw a recruiter in the mall one afternoon, the recruiting stations, bored teenager, summer between my junior and senior year, and sat down and really had a good conversation about what my opportunities could look like. I will tell you, he was either not straightforward with me or didn't really know the answer. I intended to do a career in computer programming, and I ended up in a completely different environment, but it turned out really well.
So was there a particular, event or person that kind of served as a catalyst for your career, kind of along your professional journey?
Yeah, interestingly, it was really a law professor who I had, and he was my small section contracts teacher. Contracts was not my area of interest by any means, but I got to do some independent research with him. Peter Blank was his name, Dr. Peter Blank, and he did a variety of writing and activities, and he asked me if I would want to be a research assistant for him. And I was kind of busy taking classes as quickly as I could. I was married, I had kids, and I said, I don't know that I can be a research assistant, but if I can arrange independent study credit with you, we could we could do something there. And so I worked with him, I wrote with him, I did research with him, and that was where I started off in higher education research activities. He really showed me what was possible. And then when I was getting close to graduation, he asked me what I was going to do after graduation. And I just finished my interview season and interviewed with a
Mhm.
lot of companies, a lot of law firms, and was really thinking about what I wanted to do. But I said, I don't know yet. He said, well, why don't you stay here and, put your experience as an Air Force veteran to work running things. I need somebody who can run the day-to-day work of this center. And so I stayed.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear about kind of the people along individuals' paths that really kind of changed the trajectory of their career journey.
Mhm.
And as you were describing, that professor and kind of knowing your resume and kind of where you ended up, it connects the dots. It makes a lot of sense, kind of that inspiration that was kind
Yeah.
of came out of that.
Yeah, it was really interesting because, again, he gave me an opportunity that I would have never expected, and I stayed in higher education. I loved higher ed when I was an undergraduate, when I was in law school. I really thought I was going to practice law, and I ended up not practicing law ever. I did policy research and work. I've never taken a bar exam and probably never will. But
Yeah.
the law degree served me well because it
Mhm.
really got a lot of interest areas in focus for me. So I had fun.
So James, every journey, we know has its hurdles. Can you tell us kind of some of the biggest obstacles that you faced in your career and kind of how you overcame them?
Yeah. So I was a first gen college student. I
Mhm.
knew nothing about higher education. My guidance counselor told me I was probably not college material because
Wow.
I was in high school and I was, yeah, maybe a little bit of a not good student. I was an A student when I wanted to be an A student, and I was a
Mhm.
D student when I wanted to be a D student. And so she was probably right. I probably wasn't ready for college. But when I went into the Air Force, the first year I spent learning, and it was technical education, but it was all credited to the Community College of the Air Force. That is not traditional higher education. But again, I didn't know anything about higher education. My parents didn't know anything about higher
Mhm.
education. I didn't have anybody in my family who knew anything about higher education. And so I had to learn myself through the experience, which in some ways is powerful, but
Mhm.
on the other hand, it means that you miss opportunities that you don't understand or don't know
Yeah.
about. And so I think just understanding the environment was the biggest challenge. And now, 25 years later, I've been in higher education my entire post-service career, first as 6 years as a
Mhm.
student, and then another 25 years working in higher education, either in universities and research centers. And, I founded or co-founded two, and I helped build a third. And,
Mhm.
that was really powerful to me. And so, I think that obstacle became an opportunity.
Mhm. I love that. Obstacle comes opportunity. I feel like, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Hmm.
When it's all new to you, especially with higher ed, if that's not
Hmm.
something that you have background, it sometimes feels like a scavenger hunt, blinded. Like,
Hmm.
what's next? I
Yeah.
remember the first time I had an advisor sit down and was like, with me, mentioned a GRE for graduate school. And I
Mhm.
was like, what is that? You take more tests? I didn't have any context for
Right.
it.
Right. Or the GMAT or the LSAT and all those things that you have no idea when you say, I want to do this, that's the next obstacle or barrier.
Yeah, I was naive enough to think that bachelor's diploma was all that was going to be required for
Yeah.
moving
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah. Me
Yeah.
too. Me too.
Yeah. Well, I know, today President and CEO of the National Defense University Foundation.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the work y'all do and kind of the impact of the foundation?
Yeah. So my role is really to bring resources to the university. One area of that is money. So I
Mhm.
raise money from individuals from business and industry, folks who are in the defense industrial base, patriotic philanthropists who care
Mhm.
about national security and defense and defending the homeland and thinking about all of the risks that we face in a global world with a lot of instability and a lot of
Mhm.
change and a lot of rapid change. And so part of it is bringing in money over and above what appropriated funds are available for, because there are a lot of things you can't use appropriated funds to do, first. And then the second is there's never enough. And
Mhm.
just like every other university in the world that's world class, they have endowments. They have the ability to bring in private sector partners and donations and money. And on top of that, expertise. That's the other thing. So, in a nonprofit world, it's always time, talent, treasure, right? So people
Mhm.
give you their time, they give you the benefit of their advice and their engagement and make connections. And, talent is specific to what do they know. And so a lot of
Mhm.
my partners in the defense industrial base know a lot about subject areas that our students need to know, and in some cases, our university already has fabulous connections, all the connections they need throughout the defense industrial base, particularly through the Eisenhower School at NDU. But in other
Mhm.
cases, they just need a phone call from somebody to say, hey, you should be engaged in this. You should partner with this. And I remember one time we were having a challenge getting some students into a location that we wanted to make sure that they could see the university was. I said, do you know anybody at this company? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I had dinner with them last week. I was sitting at a conference and we were chatting. So let me call them and see what we can do. And that connection was really rapid and we were able to get them to visit. In another instance, we had international fellows who were in Detroit, and one of the visits that they were supposed to do fell through. And I was able to call one of my board members who worked for a company in Detroit, GM Defense at the
Mhm.
time. She's now in another company, but she was able to arrange for our students not to go see a defense portion of GM Defense, but rather to see all of the electrical vehicle manufacturing for GM, which formed the underlying basis for a lot of the electrification efforts that were going to be happening. And so, they were able to go see that because of connection that I had through board members. And that continues now. I do the same thing. We're doing a conference in October of 2025. And one of the people planning said, hey, do you have a connection with such and such an organization? And I said, you know what? As a matter of fact, I have a board member who's also on the board of directors of that organization. I think I can help. And so I've passed that information on and made the request for that. So it really is about connecting and staying open to connections and then putting those pieces together.
Mhm. Yeah, you're like the super connector, James.
That's the thing that I love about this, though, because you get to meet so many people and you get to understand their stories and you get to understand what motivates them. And when you come across the things that mutually motivate people or that they have an interest in, connecting them becomes super easy because it's beneficial to everybody. So part of the impact that we have is how can we make those connections? And then part of the impact is just telling the story. When I first got recruited to this role and the recruiting firm said, would you be interested in heading the National Defense University Foundation? They support the National Defense University. I said, what's the National Defense University? I didn't know. And so I had to go look, and it turned out that one of my prior colleagues had been the CEO of the National Defense University Foundation. So I was able to have a conversation. And when I walked in the first day for an interview, their interim executive director was a friend from work I had done in the veteran space. And so, again, these connections, they come home and you get to really build on them. But part of that is then telling the story of the people who are involved, whichever side of the engagement they're on, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector, whether they're in or out of the university, whatever it is, there's a connection to be made.
So I know in your role, you get, on the front lines of all the very cool emerging, trends, technologies, and defense and national security. Y'all's events are just phenomenal, rolling out kind of the next thing of some of the greatest minds in
Mhm.
these areas of expertise. Can you tell us kind of what emerging trends you find most promising, or what things have kind of pinged on your radar as
Yeah.
far as the future of this sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're doing a conference on September 4th at the National Defense University with the new Center for Disruptive Technology and Future Warfare. And they're really focused on several areas that I think are really important and advancing. And one of which I had really given very little thought to, despite having a board member who's involved in some of this. One area to start with is AI. I think
Mhm.
AI, machine learning, sensing, connecting, and making sense of data is really, really critical. And there's a little bit on generative AI in there, but I think the more important component of it is actually all of the machine learning and sensing and connecting every
Mhm.
sensor to every ability to understand the world around us. I think that's probably the most promising advancing technology. And we see that in places that are using satellite imagery, that are using communication satellites to enable things, that are doing cloud-based processing, satellite imagery, and then surfacing those to people to say, hey, you should look at this based based on this pattern recognition, either that's been programmed in advance or that it's learning through that machine learning algorithm and all of those things. So that's one. I think the second one is probably just that broad base sense making of information that requires a lot of cloud compute, and the providers that are doing that, DoD and the Intel community both have a lot of cloud services, software as a service, and so on. And I think that leads also to really rapidly enabled advances in manufacturing and private sector integration into the public sector. And, a few of those things that we're seeing now in Ukraine is drone warfare and the communications around drone warfare, the jamming that's happening, the GPS that's there, or even development of fiber optic connected drones,
Mhm.
where they literally reel out 5 kilometers of fiber optic cable attached to the back of a drone so that they don't get cut off from the electronic signal warfare. But that manufacturing of drones has become so important. You see it in Turkey, you see it in Iran, you see it in places that are our allies and places that are our adversaries. We don't have as much of that in the US. And
Mhm.
there are a variety of policy reasons for that, but it's also an investment reason. And so when you see companies like Anduril coming on
Mhm.
board and their gigafactory in Ohio, or you see companies like Palantir really
Mhm.
doing that sense making, or you see companies like OpenAI and Anthropic announcing their $1 for government for a year to access their generative AI models, or the work that we do with other companies on research and development. Amazon Web Services has some really tremendous opportunities. And so working with all these private sector companies, and you can look at our website to see all the other ones. There are so many I didn't mention, but they're in the traditional defense industrial base and they're in the innovation sector both. And it really is that tie between those, and then the tie into the interagency, the students that we have
Mhm.
from international countries, our international fellows, and then the US military and diplomatic students who are here, and really robustly absorbing all of those technologies. I think that's the most exciting thing to me, and those advances are happening so rapidly.
Mhm. Yeah, no, you really hit the nail on the head with, it's happening so rapidly. And those collaborations and those partnerships are so essential
Yeah,
kind of for us to keep pace on innovation with
yeah.
this. It's way more than just one person or one agency they can't go at it alone.
No, not at all. You have to learn from what's out there and everybody who's out there. And I think that's one of the magic pieces of NDU is that we bring together so many people from so many different
Mhm.
departments and agencies and international countries and so on. We bring them together, they learn together, and learning together is important, but they also teach each other. They form relationships. They build these relationships that last decades after they're
Mhm.
here, and those advance our national security and our global stability.
So James, what, challenges or threats concern you kind of the most today? What's on your radar on the
Yeah.
on the not so good stuff, the stuff that worries
Yeah.
you?
Well, interestingly, I'll say almost all the same things I just said. That rapidity of advancement, the deployment of hypersonic missiles by our adversaries,
Yeah.
the use of AI by
Mhm.
countries that don't have the same moral constraints or ethical
Mm-mm.
guidelines and boundaries, and
Mhm.
perhaps are putting us at more risk because of that. I mean, those things all really worry me. The other one that really was not on my radar screen that I thought about earlier, is all the bio and synthetic bio and the threat of weaponized diseases. And I
Mhm.
think we're not ready for those. I mean, I think we saw that in COVID and worldwide what happened in COVID. No matter how a country responded, it wasn't really sufficient, or it was damaging, or it was both.
Mhm.
A lot more people were harmed by COVID than I think anybody ever thought could happen. Now imagine if that was intentional in other disease vectors or other
Mhm.
bio threats. And, that's again, it's one of the topics of the conference on September 4th with the Center for Disruptive Tech and Future Warfare, because bio is a threat. And I don't think we've ever thought about it in quite the same way because it is being enhanced by the delivery systems, the drones.
Mhm.
One of our researchers here talks a lot about these micro drones and how they
Mhm.
can be used as vectors for attacks with bioweapons. And that's
Mhm.
scary.
That is scary.
The other real challenge is money. And it's always money. And it is that what we are seeing is it takes a lot of money to counter the threats that are happening now. And I'm going to take it outside of the university context for a
Mhm.
minute. But when we talk about a $50,000 drone having to be defeated by a $3 million missile,
Mhm.
that's not something that's sustainable in the long term. And our defense industrial base has to work towards that. We're doing similar things with the 155 millimeter rounds. We're trying to understand how to manufacture those more quickly and get those where we need them. And we're looking at asymmetric threats where,
Mhm.
drone swarms that are small can actually be threats to major installations. And we have to learn how to counter all of those. There's a technology component of it, but there's also a strategic leadership component. And I think that's what NDU is really good at, is teaching that strategic leadership component of it. But there's so much money required to do that well and have access to these tools. I was having a conversation with somebody about AI access at the National Defense University, and we were teaching an AI experimental course in one of our
Mhm.
colleges. And I said, "So what tools are you using?" "Well, we don't actually have any that we're using at NDU because we don't have budget for it. And even if I had identified the need timely, it would have needed to have been identified 3 years ago. And then it would go through an NDAA process. And then it would go through an appropriations process. And then we would go to a contract process. And then we could have AI. Well,
Mhm.
that's 3 years from whenever we identify it. And so the ability to think about that and how do we do that early? Well, that's in part something the foundation can do. It's also in part something the private sector can do. Either we can fund the things that we need, or the private sector can provide them pro bono or at a reduced cost or in a partnership. And I think it's really critical because that learning modality here, understanding how people are being taught, what they have to have access to, how they have to use it, in order to understand what they're going to use it for in their
Mhm.
next job after they graduate here, or the next job after they've done their 2 or 3 year assignment. All of that's going to evolve so rapidly, and keeping up with it is so difficult. And our legislation process is just not built to keep up with it. Even when you have the innovation like AF Works and SoftWorks
Mhm.
and all of those, it's just not built to keep up with it in the same way. So there has to be some private sector support for that.
Well, I really appreciate you kind of shedding light on just the rate of which
Mhm.
kind of threats are not only being developed, but also being deployed
Yeah.
out, with us and our allies,
Yeah.
and kind of the much more complex, cumbersome process that we have to operate within
Mhm.
with bureaucracy and funding. And
Mhm.
but yet, you've got this gap here. And it's fascinating to kind of hear how NDU is involved in that with the
Mhm.
foundation
Mhm.
and then other partners. So
Mhm.
I appreciate you shedding light on that. I think people all too often don't realize kind of the restraints and constraints there that the
Yeah.
defense sector is trying to
Right.
operate in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting because we want to go fast, and some things are built to
Right?
go fast and some things aren't.
Some things aren't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, that is true. Public policy, especially as it relates to funding, usually not meant to go very
Not
fast.
fast. Yeah.
Yeah. So James, I know, we talked about, technology is evolving this just crazy fast rate, a rate that I think most of us still can't even wrap our brains
Mhm.
around. How do you think that's kind of shaping our approach to defense and kind of global stability?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is that we have to be more aware of what's happening and respond rapidly, which means we have to pay a lot more attention to what's happening in the private sector in other countries, in part. We also have to understand how that is being directed by governments in those countries, because it is the case that some of them can co-opt their manufacturing sectors or their computing
Mhm.
sectors or others. And you see that with Huawei, for instance. You see the challenges there where we perceive that the Chinese government is having access to all of Huawei's technologies and things like that. You see it in the consumer space with the concerns about TikTok. You see it in
Mhm.
all of the data gathering and data breaches that are happening. But what we're also seeing is a lot of state-sponsored hacking and
Mhm.
terrorism and networks that are focused on cyber. Sometimes we understand who's doing what very, very well. Other times we don't.
Mhm.
And I think there's a challenge here also with our own internal constraints and how we approach things. For instance, we're pretty aware that our adversaries and our competitors are not concerned about hacking civilian infrastructure and disrupting it. We don't do that. We're not in that same business. And it's
Mhm.
one of the things that I think separates us from them is that we don't intentionally target civilian populations with those technologies. But we do have to be prepared to defend against them, and sometimes in order to defend against them, you have to really understand how they're being used in that attack surface. And I think that's another thing that our university does exceptionally well is understand what's happening in the world by having world-class experts.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, the kind of attributing these cyber attacks is a lot more difficult than more traditional terrorist attacks
Right?
that we all kind of have in our memory. And I think that's something that folks just don't realize. And you make a great point about kind of how the battlescape is really changing
Hmm.
in the face of cyber.
Yeah. And
And
then you add space, you've got another dimension.
yeah, we got right when we still couldn't, we still haven't decided on the domains. We're going to throw another one in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So James, are there any books, programs, organizations that were particularly influential in your development as a leader?
Yeah, actually, there are several. First off, I'm going to credit Mike Haney at the Institute for Veterans and Military Families and at the
Oh.
Whitman School and now at Syracuse University as their vice chancellor. Mike really taught a lot about entrepreneurship. And in that work, because I did some things alongside of him when he was working on the entrepreneurship boot camp for veterans with disabilities, I got to observe some of his teaching. I got to learn from him. And, his PhD is in entrepreneurship and business strategy, right? So I learned a lot from him in that environment. And then when we co-founded the Institute for Veterans and Military Families, I was involved in all of the programs that were being offered by our partners and by our faculty in those partner colleges and universities. And I learned from all of them. So that entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial mindset, all of those kinds of things, that organization was very influential for me. Being there, yeah, I was a managing director, but I was also a student in those classrooms. I learned and I
Mhm.
absorbed a lot of knowledge. I had the opportunity to teach one section of one of the programs that was developed fully by someone else, but learning it well enough to teach it was also really influential. And then I had the opportunity to go overseas and teach some of the programs that were offered by the SBA, and watching how the SBA developed those in partnership with others was really, really useful. So I'd say that on the program side, it was really that. I think books, there are probably three that I would call out. One of them is more recent, and I think very useful to understand leadership, and that's by David Rubenstein, and he
Mhm.
really is focused on leadership, and he profiles leaders across sectors. He thinks about the military and diplomatic leaders. He interviews them. He pulls out certain things, but then he also did the same thing with business leaders. And so learning about all of those individuals has helped me really think about my own leadership style. And then the other two books that I would highly recommend, both by the same author, Tina Seelig, wrote them. One is what I wish I knew when I was 20. And it was really about seeing your place in the world and understanding challenges as opportunities, understanding that you could do almost anything that you decided to do if you were willing to put the work in, including learning it, but just being willing to do the work. And, they give some great examples of how they taught entrepreneurship and all of those kinds of things, but it really is also around business creativity in those. And then she wrote another book called Ingenious. It's got a subtitle that I don't remember at
Mhm.
the moment, but that one is also really, really good. And it is what I would consider to be a much larger volume than what I wish I knew when I was 20, but it covers those things in depth in ways that I think were really, really helpful. And for me, when I went into my first higher education role, running a research center and the operations of that research center, I didn't know what I didn't know, as we talked about
Mhm.
earlier. And so I had to learn a lot from the people around me. And I took that on in part, I think, because I was a veteran. And the mindset that we always had is Well, you can do it because it has to be done, right? A 12-person detachment in the middle of nowhere. We replaced power lines, 25 miles of power lines one year in the summer. It's like that is not a job that I was trained to do in any way, shape, or form. And we had 3 guys come who were power guys,
Yeah.
but it was at the beginning of the first Gulf War. And so
Yeah.
we didn't have the equipment we needed. We didn't have the teams that we needed. And so we took it on, but we could do it. And so that motivation, I think, followed me. The how, I learned a little bit more about myself later with those books and so on. So I would highly recommend all of those.
Yeah, those sound like terrific, terrific resources.
Hmm.
So when you reflect on your career, is there a moment or an accomplishment that really stands out as being, kind of especially meaningful or memorable to you?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things that I really have to touch on for a minute. One is the co-founding and building of the Institute for Veterans and Military Families at Syracuse University. That was tremendously transformative for that space. I
Mhm.
was able to work with the people who were running the 2 most important veteran employment initiatives, the 100,000 Jobs Mission at JP
Mhm.
Morgan Chase, now just the Veterans Jobs Mission, and hiring our heroes at the
Mhm.
Chamber of Commerce. And I was able to work with people like Maureen Casey and Eddie Dunn and a whole host of other people at JP Morgan. And then I was able to work with hiring our heroes, and it was a host of people, you know, the Schmeagles, and then after that, Eric and his team, and Elizabeth O'Brien, and you name them. There were so many people that I got to work with. So working on those was impactful. Establishing those was impactful. But I think the part where I see it is I'm very rarely in a room where somebody hasn't gone through one of those 3
Mhm.
programs and
Mhm.
can identify what it did for their lives and how it helped them transform and move forward. And that's a really, really proud thing. And then the other thing that I really want to mention is Student Veterans of America. And it is simply this. I didn't know what I didn't know when I went into higher education as a veteran. I found my community by accident. I was assigned to the graduate student dorms because that's where they put the adult students. And I was 25, right? And I found my community with the adult students on campus group and the adult student scholarship fund. And I volunteered in those, and I became a board member, and I became a member of student government. And I learned all those things on the fly from the people around me. But Student Veterans of America accelerated all that for veterans who came in. They really worked well to establish this campus organization culture where those chapters of Student Veterans of America were established. And I think when I left, it was probably 15 or 1600 of those chapters.
Mhm.
And they had veterans running them who were oriented to their particular college, the infrastructure there, the service providers there. Who were the advisors? Who were the folks who were very engaged with veterans? Who were the ones who could really accelerate their careers, not only by helping them, but by challenging them? And
Mhm.
so, working with that organization, I was able to help provide to the million student veterans in the world that were at locations where we had chapters that I didn't have. And that was meaningful to me for the same reasons. Occasionally I hear from people something that's been done, and where I've gone to their leadership institutes and lectured or taught in them or other things like that, those people I'm still connected with.
Mhm.
And so that's really a proud moment. And the leaders that we were able to bring to them, somebody like Bob McDonald, who was the Secretary of Defense when I was there, his team, Scott Blackburn, who's at McKinsey now, and others, we were able to introduce those to the leaders of these chapters. And I think that was transformative for them. So that's transformative for me.
Oh, that's so encouraging. I'm very familiar with both, have gone through programs with IVMF, my spouse, Student Veterans of America. And
Mhm.
as you were talking, I was thinking there isn't a single veteran or spouse that I know of in kind of our post 9/11 community that has not been engaged in one of those 2
Oh,
organizations. And
right.
it really, I mean, the work y'all did truly transformed um, kind of our military community. I feel like my generation of, vets and their families trying to put
Yeah.
life back together. And so for that, want to thank you. Those were 2 incredibly transformative initiatives. And I think that's stuff that will pay dividends for
Well,
a
and I
lifetime.
just want to throw in, this other piece. I left IVMF at about 4 years and went to Student Veterans of America.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about that. I left 11 years ago. I was thinking about that while I was prepping for today.
Yeah.
And in that 11 years, they have grown their team. They've
Mhm.
had so much more impact. And I
Mhm.
think back to the fact that some of the folks who started that are still there and expanding in their influence and their roles, and they've been promoted from within. Some have retired, others have gone on to other organizations. And at one point, there were at least 10 organizations that had people in them who had started in the leadership and running the programs of IVMF that I knew. And it's not the PayPal mafia by any means, but
Yeah.
there are people who are connected and want to make a difference and keep making a difference. And so
Yeah.
kudos to that team at Syracuse that did that. Kudos to the team at SVA and all the things that they keep doing. That's 11 years ago and 6 years ago, respectively. And I still have so much respect for everything they do and keep doing. And I
Yeah.
have seen that impact.
Mhm. So as you look, towards the future, what gives you hope about kind of the next generation of leaders, in national security?
Mhm. I think it's that they have so many resources and so much good leadership and so many exemplars of people who have led. I walk through the halls of the National Defense University and I see our International Hall of Fame inductees and I see our
Mhm.
National Hall of Fame inductees. And so many of these are people I know and I've worked with over the years, and they continue to give back. General Pace is still the Colin Powell Chair for Ethics, and a couple of other pieces of that title. And he continues to give back to the capstone students and pinnacle students who are the upcoming 1 star and 3 star. And we have so many opportunities for the colonels and captains and lieutenant colonels who are going through as O5s and O6s at NDU. And I know there are other war colleges that have those similar sorts of leadership connections. NDU maybe has a broader perspective because we are so inter-service joint and
Mhm.
understand all of those connections. We also have the largest population of those international fellows, but the ability to connect to people who are leaders, who have gone through that really important strategic leader education, who have then gone out into the military, served at least their 4 years, but many of them 20 years more,
Mhm.
and are still coming back and are still giving back. Or the ones who get out and then go into the defense industrial base or the
Mhm.
innovation sector and who can translate. One of the people who I worked with at a company, and I won't name the company, but said, a lot of people within the Department of Defense think that now that we're in a contractor, we're the enemy. And he
Mhm.
said, really just that I took off this suit and put on this other suit, and I'm still in the same mission. And I'm encouraged by that because that is what I hear from everybody I work with in the defense sector, in the innovation sectors. They all are committed to our country, our
Mhm.
nation. And I am very optimistic because there are so many good people committed to doing good things.
So, kind of the last question I have for the interview is, do you have any final words of advice that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, I would say get engaged. And it doesn't matter
Mhm.
what stage of your career or education you're in. Get engaged. Go to where something is happening, where you're going to meet somebody, talk to them, and don't be a wallflower. I think you have to talk to people. I think you have to
Mhm.
understand. And I am an introvert. I really am an introvert. I have to work hard to get energized and be a people person, right? It's worth it because
Mhm.
after I do that, while I might need to take a little bit of a break as an introvert, I come away so energized because we're talking about something that matters. We're
Mhm.
talking about cooperative research and development agreements with companies that are right at the forefront, thinking about gaming and simulation and AI and
Mhm.
cyber. And how do we do research together with them from the National Defense University? But that also applies across the board, whether it's the foundation or the university or any of the other war colleges or the other war college foundations. We're doing our Patriot dinner shortly. We're honoring Gwen Shotwell. And Gwen Shotwell, as the CEO and as the president and COO of SpaceX,
Mhm.
is really a great role model for this because she is giving back to the defense sector and she came from a place of commercial success, but understanding how its application could make government better, could make our Department of Defense better. And when you think about SpaceX and launch, they're even launching their competitors' satellites. When you look at what they're doing, that's pretty amazing. And to have somebody like that come and speak and really engage, that only comes because somebody else engaged her. One of my board members reached out and said, "Hey, I know you from this. Could you do this?" That's where you want to be when you're in that stage of your career. You want to be able to dial up a leader and say, "Can you come help with this? Will you do this with me?" I think that that's the advice I have. Don't be afraid to ask. The worst thing they're going to do is say no. They might only say no once or twice. They might say yes. And it might be that it's 5 years down the line from the first time that you ask that you get that connection to do what it is that you wanted to do together in the first place. That's the magic. So go out and connect to people wherever you are.
Those are wise words.
Thanks,
Thank
Hannah.
you. Well, thanks so much, James, for sharing, your story, your insights on the podcast, your
Mhm.
contributions to our nation. I know continue to impact so many, and I appreciate you taking time to talk with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Tipping Spears. We hope this conversation has sparked new ideas and challenged the way you think about our future. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time with another exciting guest.